Listen to the ceaseless mechanical grind of the servo skulls patrolling the darkness high above. They are the restless dead, suspended in anti-gravitic fields, ferrying the memories of the damned through the abyssal canyons of this archival vault. I sit here in the absolute depths of the Adeptus Administratum, breathing in the stench of decaying parchment, rotting vellum, and the acrid bite of centuries-old iron gall ink. It is the true perfume of the Imperium. Above me, failing lumen globes sputter and die, casting long, shivering shadows across aisles of data shrines that stretch onward into a suffocating, dust-choked blackness. It is a word I've not read in an age, a quaint, forgotten myth traded by fools and dreamers. To even whisper of peace in this darkest of millenniums is to court the cleansing fire of the Inquisition. There is no peace amongst the stars, only an eternity of carnage and the laughter of thirsting gods. I am an old man, a Lord Archivist, whose bones ache with the cold of 1,000,000 dead worlds. I have sat before this brass voxcaster for centuries, bound to the endless tally of the fallen. I have personally recorded the deaths of billions. I have watched entire planetary populations, billions of souls, erased from the great ledgers before the ink of their birth records had even dried. We find ourselves trapped within the Era Indomitus, a grand and triumphant title bestowed by high lords and demigods. Yet I see nothing but the same exhausted slaughter. The sheer, crushing weight of our imperial history presses down upon the ceiling of this vault. For 10,000 years, the master of mankind has sat immobile upon the golden throne of terror. 10,000 years of continuous, unbroken warfare has ground the bones of humanity into the very dust that coats my robes. Do not speak to me of salvation. Hope was slaughtered millennia ago in the fires of betrayal. We do not fight to win anymore. We fight simply out of a grim, agonizing duty to survive the night. Every ledger I close is a planetary tombstone. Every scroll I bind is a graveyard for regiments whose names are forgotten the moment they march into the meat grinder of the front lines. Yet, my dusty ledgers capture only the cold mathematics of our doom. To truly understand the shape of our nightmare, one must lift their weary eyes from the rotting paper. High above the endless rows of these sepulchral shelves, illuminated by the dying amber light of the sanctum, hangs the grand cartograph of the Emperor's realm, a master map of the galaxy. But it is no longer the galaxy I memorized as a novice. It is a broken, bleeding thing. My eyes are drawn inextricably upward, tracing the catastrophic scar that has violently torn our universe in half. A jagged wound of madness and churning warp fire that spills across the void and severs us entirely from the light. For it was not enough that our enemies battered at the gates of reality. The gate itself was shattered from within. Look upward into the poisoned skies of 1,000,000 worlds, and you will no longer see the cold, indifferent comfort of the void. You will see the Cicatrix Maledictum, the Great Rift. It is not merely an astrophysical phenomenon or a turbulence of stellar gases. It is a laceration across the throat of the galaxy, a hemorrhaging metaphysical wound where the raw, unthinking malice of the warp bleeds freely into the realm of flesh and matter. To behold it is to feel the sanity slowly drain from your skull. It is a cosmic scar of bruised purples, sickened greens, and violent magenta,
roiling with the screaming faces of unborn gods and the hateful glares of entities older than time.
The psychological and spiritual toll this cataclysm has exacted upon our species cannot be quantified by the infinite scrolls of the Administratum. It is measured instead in the mass suicides that sweep through suffocating hive cities, in the sudden, agonizing mutations of the innocent, in the weeping of stone monuments and the torrential rains of boiling blood. When the galaxy first tore asunder, humanity was cast into the Noctis Aeterna, the days of blinding. Try to comprehend the sheer, unadulterated terror of absolute cosmic isolation. The Astronomicon, the Emperor's divine beacon that guides our countless vessels through the treacherous tides of the Imperium, was violently snuffed out. In those suffocating days of darkness, the astropathic choirs did not merely go silent. They ignited. Tens of thousands of sanctionites burned from the inside out in a chorus of unimaginable agony, their fragile minds completely overloaded by the deafening static of 1 trillion daemons rushing through the breach. Entire planetary systems, bastions of industry, and faith housing trillions of beating hearts simply vanished beneath the churning warp tides. They were swallowed whole by the dark, their dying screams echoing forever in the immaterial sea. Now, the glorious Imperium of man exists as a fractured corpse, cleanly severed down its spine by a blade of pure nightmare. On this side of the ruin lies Imperium Sanctus. Here, the Emperor's golden light still manages to penetrate the gloom, though it flickers faintly, like a dying candle caught in a ferocious gale. We bleed, but we can still see the shadows that hunt us. But across the threshold of the rift lies Imperium Nihilus, the Dark Imperium. Half of the master of mankind's domain, completely cut off from the light of holy terror, plunged into a suffocating abyss of unending night.
There is no celestial navigation there. There is no hope of reinforcement.
The isolated worlds of Nihilus are trapped in an eternity of absolute madness, besieged night and day by demonic incursions, slaughtered by traitorous warbands who now carve out gruesome empires of bone and ash. We are but microscopic insects crawling upon a grand tapestry that is actively catching fire, entirely ignorant of the inferno until the flames consume our fragile limbs. The sheer scale of this tragedy reduces the greatest architectural triumphs and military victories of mankind to meaningless dust. To truly comprehend the magnitude of the Cicatrix Maledictum is to understand a cosmic horror so absolute it threatens to completely paralyze the beating heart of the imperial war machine. Yet paralysis is a luxury the dying cannot afford. When faced with the total extinction of the human soul, the remnants of our shattered empire must stare into that ravenous abyss and find the ruthless resolve to endure, preparing to cross lines that should never be crossed. Against the bleeding backdrop of this divided reality, the ultimate bulwark holding back the dark is not the ceramite plate of the Adeptus Astartes. It is the parchment and the ledger. The true weapon of the Imperium of man is the spreadsheet, wielded with cold, mechanical indifference by the faceless adepts of the Adeptus Administratum and the Departamento Munitorum. To mobilize a single battle fleet across the blackened void requires a bureaucratic mechanism so staggering and soul-crushing that it breaks the minds of lesser men.
These holy armadas are not fueled by Prometheum alone. They are propelled by mountains of transit dockets, requisition forms, and astropathic ledgers, stamped by generations of scribes born in the darkness of the macro-archives who will die without ever seeing the stars. Under the merciless mandate of the Lex Imperialis, the true cost of survival is exacted through the imperial tithe. Entire planetary populations are stripped of their humanity, reduced to mere digits upon an endless scroll.
A world is judged solely by its industrial output or the genetic viability of its citizens to serve as fresh meat for the endless grinder of the Astra Militarum. Men, women and children are not viewed as souls to be saved by the grace of the Golden Throne, but as perishable commodities to be weighed against quotas of lasguns, corpse starch ration packs and artillery shells. And in this grand calculus of annihilation, the Administratum operates with terrifying, acceptable margins of error. The scale of the Imperium is so unfathomably vast that a single misplaced cipher or a drop of spilled ink upon a sector supply manifest can doom entire systems to a slow, agonizing demise. A simple clerical mistake by a fatigued adept might rout essential agricultural transports away from a teeming hive world, leaving 10 billion souls to starve and eventually cannibalize one another in the lightless underhives. Another stroke of a quill might deploy a crusade of 1 billion Imperial guardsmen to an entirely empty, lifeless sector, leaving them to rot from void sickness and starvation, while the actual frontline collapses under Xenos invasion. To the calculating masters of the Munitorum, these are not unspeakable tragedies. They are statistical inevitabilities, casually written off as rounding errors in the margins of a holy ledger. Yet these detached, theoretical calculations of survival do not remain confined to the vaulted halls of terror. As the grinding gears of this macro-logistics engine turn,
the cold numbers of the Administratum begin to bleed directly into the physical universe, translating into the horrific practical miseries that are about to be unleashed upon the desperate populations below.
To comprehend the true horror of this bureaucratic leviathan is to understand the mathematics of human despair. The tithe is not merely a ledger of grain or promethium extracted from a compliant populace. It is the systematic consumption of entire biospheres to fuel a fire that can never be quenched. Consider the countless agri-worlds, endless continents of monoculture engineered solely to feed the insatiable maw of the war machine. Their populations are driven into early graves, their oceans drained, and their soil pumped with caustic alchemical fertilizers until the very earth collapses into toxic ash. When the planet can no longer yield the required megatonnage, it is summarily abandoned, a withered husk left to rot in the silent void. And then there are the Forge worlds. Planetary-scale factories where the heavens are hidden forever beneath a suffocating blanket of heavy smog and chemical rain. Here, billions are born, labor, and die upon the screeching assembly lines without ever knowing the warmth of a natural sun. They are crushed beneath the weight of impossible production quotas, their lungs bleeding and their flesh giving out long before the holy machines they tend ever require maintenance. Yet even these planetary agonies pale before the ultimate calculus of the High Lords of Terror. In the grand strategy of the Imperium, space and time are commodities purchased directly with blood. Picture the sprawling hive worlds, 50 billion souls crammed into towering spires of ferrocrete, living in ignorance of the doom approaching from the stars.
To a local planetary governor, this is a bustling metropolis, the pinnacle of localized achievement. To the cold masters of the Administratum, it is merely friction to be applied against an enemy advance.
When a tendril of the Great Devourer or an endless greenskin armada spills into a sector, the High Command does not immediately rush their fleets to defend the innocent. They calculate. If feeding a hive world of 50 billion men, women and children to an invading fleet will stall the enemy for just 3 standard weeks, the order is given without a single second of remorse. The astropathic choirs crying out for aid are ignored. The orbital defense networks are intentionally left devoid of reinforcements. The local defense forces are abandoned to die in the dark, fighting a hopeless war they were entirely engineered to lose. 3 weeks of logistical breathing room, bought and paid for with 50 billion screaming corpses. This is the terrifying truth of the Emperor's realm. Human lives are the cheapest, most abundant currency in the galaxy, spent with a callousness that defies human comprehension. 1,000 star systems are continuously bled dry, their resources stripped, and their populations offered up as localized kindling just to stall the inevitable doom pressing in from the outer dark. This is the unyielding foundation of the Imperial war economy. It is a nightmare of logistics, a galaxy-spanning meat grinder where every single bolt shell and ration pack is baptized in the suffering of unseen innocence. And all of this unending misery, all of these deliberately sacrificed worlds and suffocated billions, is merely the baseline reality of existence. It is the necessary price of survival, the grim stage that must be set before a single shot is fired, before the true instruments of the Emperor's wrath are even drawn from their scabbards to face the encroaching night. To fuel this incomprehensible logistical engine, the Imperium pays its ultimate tithe in the currency of raw, trembling human flesh. Drawn from countless diverse worlds across the galaxy, these endless tithes form the Astra Militarum, the Imperial Guard. They are the grand anvil upon which the enemies of mankind are mercilessly broken. You must understand, this is not a realm of soaring, mythical heroism. It is a sprawling, industrial slaughterhouse where survival is an anomaly. The domain of the Imperial Guard is an apocalyptic landscape of endless, flooded trenches, ruined earth, and shattered concrete. Here, the senses are utterly overwhelmed. The air is forever choked with the suffocating stench of churning mud, spilled blood, burning promethium, and the sharp chemical tang of ozone. Above these shivering lines of mortal men and women, the sky is torn apart by the ceaseless, deafening roar of massed Earthshaker artillery batteries. They fire in endless barrages day and night, turning the horizon into a permanent sunrise of destruction that pounds alien horrors and heretical fortresses into microscopic ash. Down in the filth of the trenches, the darkness is pushed back by the blinding, strobing flash of millions of lasguns firing in unison. It is a desperate, searing wall of crimson energy, discharged by terrified hands. The baseline human soldier is frail, clad only in cheap, mass-produced flak armor, staring into the abyss at monsters that haunt the darkest recesses of the mind. They are petrified, yet they do not break. They drown superior alien technology and towering unnatural beasts in a tidal wave of sheer, unyielding numbers, burying their foes under mountains of their own dead. But natural courage alone cannot hold such a line against the darkness of the void. Behind these huddled masses stand the unforgiving officers of the Commissariat.
Clad in imposing stark black,
wielding heavy bolt pistols and wielding absolute, unquestioned authority, they are the grim enforcers of Imperial discipline. A guardsman knows with absolute certainty that to step backward, to show cowardice in the face of the enemy, invites immediate and summary execution. They fear the devouring alien swarm, yes, but they are taught to fear the Commissar more. This brutal, callous mathematics of morale is tragically necessary. In the hottest, most brutal combat zones across the galaxy, the statistical life expectancy of a newly deployed frontline guardsman is a mere 15 hours. That is the entirety of their service. 15 hours of cold, damp terror, deafening noise, and frantic prayer before they are ground into the blood-soaked muck. and when they fall, they are replaced instantly by the next nameless conscript, stepping blindly over their shattered corpse to fire into the dark. The Astra Militarum is the great, grinding sledgehammer of the Emperor, winning impossible wars of attrition through the agonizing, wholesale sacrifice of entire generations. Yet, for all their boundless, tragic sacrifice and their oceanic numbers, this blunt instrument of endless infantry represents only the broad strokes of Imperial warfare. When the hammer and the anvil are not enough, when a precise, devastating strike into the very heart of the abyss is demanded by the masters of terror.
Where the billions of the Astra Militarum bleed and drown in the frozen mud.
To hold a single ruined trench line for a handful of days, the master of mankind possesses another instrument entirely. They are not the blunt sledgehammer of endless attrition. They are the scalpel, the surgical decapitation strike meant to sever the head of the enemy. Before the body even realizes it is dead, they are the Adeptus Astartes, the Space Marines. When the siege is entirely broken and the human lines are failing, the sky simply tears open. They do not march to war across blasted fields. They plummet directly from the heavens in burning ceramite teardrops, meteors of absolute wrath screaming through the tortured atmosphere. The seismic impact of their drop pods shatters the earth and shatters fortresses. Before the dust of their arrival can even begin to settle, the explosive ramps blow wide and the angels of death are already among the enemy. It is in this exact fraction of a second that mortal minds invariably break. It is a psychological phenomenon known to the scholars of war as transhuman dread. To look upon a giant standing nearly 9 feet tall, impossibly broad and encased in inches of impenetrable armor, is terrifying enough for a regular soldier. But to witness that towering armored colossus move with a liquid, blinding speed, a velocity that profoundly defies all biological logic and the laws of mass, utterly paralyzes the mortal psyche. The brain simply cannot process the threat. The Astartes do not fight with the desperate, fearful frenzy of mortal men. They move with an eerie, calculated, post-human precision, slaughtering with mathematical efficiency. The deafening thunder of their holy bolters, firing diamond-tipped, mass-reactive warheads that detonate deep within the flesh of their targets, is the only liturgy of mercy they will ever offer. Yet to forge such perfect weapons of utter terror requires a supreme and terrible sacrifice. They are no longer truly human. To become an Astartes is to be violently stripped of all mortal frailty, and with it, nearly all mortal compassion.
They are selected from the harshest death worlds as mere children, subjected to decades of agonizing physical surgeries and brutal psycho-indoctrination.
Their childhood memories are burned away, their minds systematically rebuilt to know nothing but unwavering duty, xenophobia, and war. The holy gene seed, the genetic legacy of the Emperor's legendary primarchs, is grafted into their bodies. It cultivates redundant organs, fuses their rib cages into solid bulletproof plates, and mutates them into literal demigods of destruction. They are completely divorced from the fragile species they are sworn to protect, elevated far above us so that they alone might bear the crushing weight of our ongoing survival. They are emotionless sentinels, immaculate angels crafted entirely from violence. They are the gleaming spear of humanity thrust deep into the heart of the encroaching darkness, the ultimate bulwark against the dying of the light. Yet, for all their unmatched martial might, for all the biological miracles of their grim creation and the invincible aura of their towering presence, the galaxy remains vast, uncaring, and profoundly hostile. Even the Adeptus Astartes, these flawless executioners of the Emperor's will, find their chapters stretched agonizingly thin across the endless void of the Imperium. Because the horrors that lurk just beyond the flickering light of the Astronomicon, the ancient nightmares currently stirring in the deepest, coldest shadows of the cosmos, demand a toll far greater than just the blood of men and the fury of transhumans. Yet where the Adeptus Astartes apply violence as a scalpel, there exists a force that drowns the galaxy in an ocean of blunt, rusty blades. To look upon the orc and see merely a screaming barbarian is the fatal conceit of 1,000 doomed planetary governors. The greenskin is no mere savage.
It is the most horrifyingly successful biological weapon ever unleashed upon the material realm.
When humanity wages war, we bring our logistics, our rations, our supply lines forged of blood and sweat. When the orc goes to war, it brings its entire ecosystem. Every drop of orc blood shed upon a world releases millions of microscopic spores into the atmosphere. They do not just invade a planet, they terraform it into a crucible of unending violence. Deep within the shattered Earth, far out of sight of our grand macro-cannon batteries, the insidious spores take root.
First come the squigs,
Vicious, simple beasts designed only to feed the growing tide. Then the snotlings and the Gretchen, subservient forms born with an inherent genetic knowledge of how to build, scrape, and prepare the way for their masters. And finally, bursting from the ground like a sickening harvest, the orc warriors themselves, fully formed and thirsting for slaughter. A world is not merely conquered by the greenskin, it is digested and reborn as a perpetual breeding ground. This absolute perfection of design is no accident of blind evolution. Millions of years before humanity ever looked up from the dirt of terror, the godlike entities known as the Old Ones engineered the ancestors of the orcs to fight a war that shattered the very fabric of reality. They were the Krork, towering titans of logic and war, clad in advanced armor and unmatched in their terrifying martial glory. The Old Ones are dust, their cosmic empires erased from time itself, but their ultimate weapon survived. The orcs of today are but the degenerate echoes of those ancient titans, stripped of their high intellect, but retaining every ounce of their indestructible, self-replicating vitality. It is a truth that borders on the heretical, yet it haunts the midnight hours of every chronicler within the Black Library.
We fear them, but deep within our withered souls, perhaps we also envy them.
Look upon the state of our galaxy. Look upon the encroaching darkness, the endless slaughter, the despair that chokes the stars. To humanity, to the ancient Aeldari, this is an agonizing, slow death. To the orc, it is absolute paradise. They are the only true victors in this grim reality, because the galaxy is exactly as they desire it to be, a massive, eternal war zone. They know no existential dread, they suffer no crisis of faith. There is only the intoxicating joy of the fight, the thunderous roar of the horde, and the sacred promise of a greater battle tomorrow. And it is this horrific, joyous vitality that demands we understand a far more terrifying question. If they are a fungal plague, born from the soil of shattered worlds, one must naturally wonder how an infestation of such primal violence manages to tear itself from the dirt and hurl its green fury across the silent, unforgiving void of the stars. Yet this terrestrial resilience is merely the prelude to a far greater horror, one that bleeds upward into the cold abyss of space. To look upon an orc armada is to behold a profane affront to the very laws of physics. Where the Imperial Navy relies upon rigid doctrine, mathematically perfect adamantium prows, and the solemn calculations of sanctioned void logisticians, The alien approaches the theater of the stars with the same crude, thuggish brutality it applies to a trench fight. They do not build fleets, they agglomerate them. Drifting macro-graveyards of void junk, ruined Imperial galleons, and dead Xenos craft are lashed together with gargantuan tethers and crude plasma welds to form space hulks of unfathomable mass. Worse still are the rocks.
These are hollowed-out planetoids, stripped from dead asteroid belts, retrofitted with colossal, highly unstable engine blocks, and bristling with thousands of stolen macro-cannons.
It is a nightmare of sheer macro-logistics, mountains of jagged scrap metal propelled through the dark by little more than raw, untethered aggression. By all the sacred laws of the Adeptus Mechanicus, these towering abominations should tear themselves apart the moment their crude thrusters ignite. Yet they do not. This reveals the true existential terror of the greenskin menace. The Waaagh is not merely a barbaric war cry, but a massive Gestalt psychic field, a subconscious emanation generated by millions of orcs gathered in singular, violent purpose. This collective, reality-bending static subtly lubricates rusted cogs, seals catastrophic vacuum breaches, and keeps volatile atomic cores from instantly detonating. Their engines burn, their rusted guns fire, and their impossible ships sail the void simply because the orc species fundamentally believes that they will. To stand upon the command deck of an orc flagship is to be subjected to a deafening cacophony that would shatter a mortal mind. It is a localized madness of bellowing war bosses, screeching subspecies, and half-crazed mech boys physically hammering upon sparking consoles with heavy wrenches to force them into compliance. There is no void logic here. There is no elegant maneuvering. There is only the roaring, unquantifiable momentum of a species that views the cosmos solely as a canvas for kinetic violence. When this green tide finally reaches a civilized world, they do not engage in calculated orbital bombardments or surgical lance strikes against defense installations. They simply hurl their titanic, multi-megaton rocks directly into the planetary defense grid.
The sheer brute force physics of an iron-rich asteroid driven by overloaded thrusters and the collective willpower of a million screaming beasts shatters orbital stations into dust and plunges deep into the target world's crust.
It is a tidal wave of chaotic, unstoppable force, a battering ram of absolute anarchy that cares nothing for casualties, strategy, or the sanctity of the void. And yet, as terrifying as this blunt instrument of mindless slaughter may be, it stands in stark, jarring opposition to the threats waiting deeper in the shadows of the galaxy, where wars are not won by roaring hordes and falling iron, but through cold, invisible manipulation and the elegant, silent stroke of a poisoned blade. Yet while the alien brute crashes through the galaxy like a mindless tide of iron and fury, there exists a far more insidious Xenos breed, one that treats the slaughter of billions as nothing more than the turning of a cosmic page. The Aeldari, the so-called craft-world Eldar. To speak of them is to taste the foul ash of unparalleled, unbearable arrogance. They do not fight with the honest, bloody brutality of the greenskin. Instead, they skulk at the freezing edge of the void, their decrepit farseers casting runes of psychic wraithbone to read the shifting, multi-dimensional skeins of fate. They peer down the diverging paths of the future, weighing the absolute destruction of 1,000 human worlds against the heartbeat of a single, miserable Eldar life. And always, without exception, they find the lives of humanity completely worthless. To understand their absolute reliance on such cowardly manipulation, one must look into the abyss of their greatest shame. Long before the Master of Mankind united the techno-barbarians of Holy Terror, the ancient Eldar Empire drowned the stars in debauchery so vile, so absolute, that it tore a gaping, bleeding wound into the fabric of reality itself.
Their boundless, degenerate hedonism birthed a dark god.
Slaanesh, she who thirsts. This ruinous power awoke and instantly devoured their pantheon, swallowed the souls of trillions of their kind, and shattered their majestic civilization into cosmic driftwood. Now every single Aeldari soul is forever damned, destined from birth to be consumed by the gaping maw of the nightmare they themselves created. They are a dying, withered race, clinging to the rotting fragments of their past aboard massive, wandering world ships. They cannot fight honest wars of attrition. They simply do not have the numbers to spend in the grand, bloody meat grinder of galactic conflict. And so, they cheat, they deceive, they pluck at the invisible strings of destiny to ensure others bleed in their stead. They are the ultimate puppet masters of the cosmos. A Farseer will sit entombed in his crystal sanctuary, his mind adrift in the warp, and calculate that 3 centuries from now, an expanding Imperial subsector might accidentally encroach upon the migratory path of an Aeldari craft world. To prevent this, to alter a mere possibility still hundreds of years from realization, they will not hesitate to act today. With cold, sociopathic precision, they will deliberately bait the very Waaagh you have just witnessed, subtly shifting astropathic relays and leaving a trail of psychic breadcrumbs that redirects the greenskin horde directly into our thriving, defenseless systems. Trillions of loyal Imperial citizens will burn in atomic fire. Generations of human endeavor will be reduced to radioactive slag. And the Aeldari will watch from afar, feeling no pity, feeling no guilt, harboring only a smug, sickly satisfaction that their delicate hands remain clean while the lesser races butcher one another for their preservation. But prophecy and grand, overarching manipulation are merely the prelude to their treacherous arts. When the intricate skeins of fate demand direct, unavoidable intervention, when the fragile threads of destiny must be severed by a physical blade rather than a whispered lie, they do not march to war in the glorious uniform ranks of the Astra Militarum. They strike from the shadows, utilizing ancient, impossible pathways through dimensions we cannot fathom to bypass our defensive lines entirely, preparing to deploy specialized killers whose entire existence is devoted to the perfect execution of sudden, overwhelming violence. To enact these meticulously woven threads of fate, the Aeldari do not subject themselves to the treacherous, soul-rending tides of the Imperium as our navigators must. They traverse the webway. It is a fractal labyrinth of impossible geometries, a dimension of shimmering twilight suspended delicately between the cold reality of the Imperium and the roiling, demonic madness of the warp. This network is an ancient artery, a crumbling, majestic relic, forged by a forgotten empire that ruled the heavens millions of years before humanity first crawled from the irradiated dust of Holy Terror. Through these shattered, hidden pathways, the Xenos move completely unseen by human augurs. They do not wage the grinding, blood-soaked wars of attrition that define the Astra Militarum. They are the absolute masters of asymmetric warfare. Imagine the sheer, terrifying perfection of an Aeldari strike force. An Imperial governor sits secure within a highly fortified hive spire, layered in overlapping void shields and bristling with orbital defense lasers that could crack a small moon. To the human mind, it is an impregnable fortress of adamantium and faith. To the Aeldari, it is merely a crude trap with an unlocked back door. They deploy their aspect warriors, alien zealots who have dedicated centuries to a single, flawless doctrine of murder. Stepping seamlessly from a localized webway spa, they manifest directly within the heart of the command sanctum. They completely bypass the sprawling trench networks, the grinding columns of armor, and the millions of conscripted souls standing watch in the freezing mud outside. The critical target is systematically assassinated, their life ended by a hyper-monomolecular blade or a torrent of blinding shuriken fire. Then the strike force vanishes back into the labyrinthian mist before the very first alarm klaxon even begins to wail. The sheer paranoia this breeds within the high echelons of the Imperium is an insidious infection. Decorated commanders find themselves staring into the shadows of their own impregnable vaults, trembling at the realization that their massed macro batteries and millions of loyal guardsmen are utterly useless against an enemy that strikes from nowhere. The lumbering, unyielding giant of the Imperium swings its colossal hammer, only to find it is fighting phantoms who refuse to bleed on the giant's terms. We have studied the unbreakable grinding anvil of the Imperial war machine. We have witnessed the feral, overwhelming tide of the alien hordes. We have peered into the surgical, fate-bound strikes of the Aeldari and felt the crushing, reality-warping inevitability of the ruinous powers. Now, the theoretical postulations end. These four vastly different doctrines of slaughter are drawn by the unseen threads of destiny toward a singular catastrophic convergence, and they're about to collide on a single doomed world.
To witness these vast, merciless philosophies of slaughter made manifest, we must draw our gaze down from the abstract void and look upon the soot-choked skies of Obelis Secundus.
Beneath the toxic bruise-purple clouds of this vital Promethean world stands Hive Primus, a towering rusted monument to human industry and profound ignorance. Billions of souls toil in the sweltering, lightless depths of the lower levels, their entire existences measured only in grueling shifts and punishing production quotas. They are entirely blind to the sheer scale of the galaxy and entirely unaware of the unfathomable doom hurtling toward them through the cold abyss. The atmosphere within the Hive City is heavy, suffocating, tasting perpetually of blood, sweat, and unburnt fuel. A fragile, miserable normalcy reigns here, maintained only by the relentless, deafening heartbeat of colossal refineries and the brutal, unforgiving discipline of the local enforcers. But the vastness of the cosmos is rarely kind to the ignorant, and the end of days rarely announces itself with immediate fire. The first omens of annihilation do not strike the earth, but instead manifest as a creeping, invisible sickness in the high strata of the atmosphere. High above the planetary smog layer, the ancient orbiting auger arrays of the defense network begin to register impossible and terrifying data. Massive gravitational anomalies are tearing at the very edges of the star system. The fabric of real space itself is buckling under the weight of something impossibly massive moving through the tides of the warp. Then comes the sudden, agonizing silencing of the Immaterium. Deep within the heavily shielded and ornate sanctums of the upper hive spire, the planetary astropathic choir is struck by a collective, violent agony. Dozens of sanctioned psychers fall to the cold iron decking in unison, writhing and thrashing as the local currents of the warp are suddenly choked by a suffocating alien fury.
They scream in absolute terror, bleeding dark, thick blood from their blind eyes.
Their fragile minds utterly shattering under the crushing weight of an approaching psychic pressure. It is the psychic shadow of the Waaagh, a monstrous, thrumming tidal wave of primitive and brutal intent that utterly drowns out the guiding light of the Astronomicon, plunging the entire planet into sudden, terrifying astropathic isolation. The planetary governor, previously safe within his gilded and heavily fortified spire, receives the fragmented, babbling final warnings of the dying psychers. A cold, absolute panic completely paralyzes the local high command. Martial law is declared across the globe, enacted not with a steady, measured decree, but with the frantic, terrified slamming of emergency containment protocols. The gargantuan, rust-pitted blast doors of the middle hive begin to grind shut, sealing billions inside their metal tombs. The endless droning thrum of the manufactorums is suddenly drowned out by the rising mournful wail of citywide civil defense sirens echoing down through thousands of levels of steel and human despair. The billions of citizens who only moments ago knew nothing but their endless labor are suddenly plunged into a paralyzing, suffocating terror. They look upward, past the dripping promethium pipes and the choking smog, sensing a horrific shift in the very gravity of their world. The planetary defense forces are hastily mustered from their barracks, their ancient laser guns trembling in the hands of terrified, ill-equipped conscripts as they are violently pushed onto the rain-slicked outer battlements of the upper hive. The true storm has not yet broken, but the dread is absolute, a heavy weight pressing down upon the souls of every living human on Obelis Secundus. The immense, heavily armored planetary defense grids slowly tilt their gargantuan macro-cannons toward the heavens, waiting in the dreadful, agonizing silence for the black void of space to finally tear open. High above the frightened billions, the void erupted into a theater of apocalyptic geometry. System defense monitors and orbital macro cannons unleashed their furies in a desperate bid to hold the line against the encroaching Orc armada. To witness void warfare is to comprehend a staggering, almost incomprehensible scale of destruction. We speak of macro shells the sheer size of towering hab blocks, solid slugs of adamantium and depleted deuterium hurled across thousands of kilometers of hard vacuum. Each volley carried the kinetic yield to shatter tectonic plates, yet they were met by an enemy of impossible, crude mass. The Orc rocks did not maneuver in any traditional naval sense. They simply accelerated, a tidal wave of rusted scrap and weaponized asteroids plunging recklessly into the orbital defense grid. Between this torrential rain of death and the fragile surface of the world below stood only the planetary macro-void shields. To understand the salvation these ancient relics provide, one must understand their fundamentally blasphemous nature. A void shield does not merely deflect an impact. It is a localized fracture in reality, a technological tether that catches unimaginable kinetic energy and displaces it directly into the immaterium. Every strike of a crude torpedo, every glancing blow from a plunging scrap ship was swallowed by the Sea of Souls, painting the upper atmosphere with ghostly, bleeding auroras. But even the warp can only consume so much, and the generators buried deep within the crust began to scream in agony. Down in the subterranean vault complexes, entire worker clans were immolated as cooling towers flashed into molten slag. The tech priests chanted their final desperate litanies to the motive force as the ancient dynamos shook themselves apart. Above them, the sky did not merely light up. It burned with prismatic fire, a violent kaleidoscopic bruising of the heavens as the interlocking shields absorbed punishment far beyond their breaking point. The sound of a dying void shield is an atrocity against the senses. It is a shrieking, metallic wail that vibrates through the teeth and bones of every living creature on the planet, a sound of reality itself tearing at the seams. And then, under the sheer crushing weight of millions of tons of descending alien iron, the absolute threshold was breached. The planetary defenses finally buckled. The overlapping energy grids shattered in a cascading sequence of blinding white detonations, raining ethereal fallout across the clouds. The roof had been violently torn off the world, leaving the sprawling hive cities completely naked against the weeping sky. The orbital supremacy of the Imperial Navy was broken into burning debris, and there was nothing left to stop the descending storm of rusted steel and howling savagery from plunging directly toward the vulnerable surface below. With the planetary void shield shattered into fading static, the heavens were thrown wide open to the wrath of the greenskin armada. The Orcs do not possess the martial elegance of Imperial drop pods or the precision of Astartes' strike cruisers. They do not land, they crash. What descended from the bruised upper atmosphere was a kinetic horror of apocalyptic proportions. Millions of tons of burning scrap metal, cobbled together rusted hulks, and hollowed-out asteroids known as drop rocks plummeted through the clouds, trailing thick plumes of oily black smoke and atmospheric fire. These crude, brutalist meteors did not aim for the barren wastes or the reinforced landing fields. They were aimed directly at the towering, densely populated hive spires. The impacts were world-shattering. When the first drop rocks smashed into the upper levels of the hive cities, the kinetic force was so absolute that millions of Imperial citizens were instantly vaporized, reduced to atomic shadows painted against shattering adamantium walls. Entire hab blocks collapsed like brittle glass under the hammer of the alien gravity strikes, sending apocalyptic shockwaves rippling through the planet crust. But the horror of the impact was merely the herald of the true nightmare. Before the blinding flash of kinetic devastation had even faded, explosive bolts blew the heavy, jagged ramps of the crashed vessels wide open. Out of the churning dust and the burning rubble poured the green tide. Millions of Orc warriors, roaring with a primal, deafening joy, flooded into the ruins of the shattered spires. They spilled from their burning descent craft not as an organized military force, but as an avalanche of muscle, rusted iron, and unfettered bloodlust. Yet the greenskin threat is never solely mechanical or martial. As the brutes charged into the screaming throngs of the outer hab zones, the biological contagion of their race began its insidious work. The air itself grew thick with their foulness. From the exhaust vents of their crude war engines and the shedding flesh of the beasts themselves, billions of microscopic fungal spores pumped immediately into the atmosphere. This dense, greasy smog began choking the air, coating the pulverized masonry and the blasted soil in a sickly, rapid-growing alien biomatter. The very atmosphere of the Imperial world was being terraformed in minutes, corrupted into a humid, toxic soup that burned the lungs of the fleeing populace and fertilized the ground for the next generation of the Xenos breed. In the outer habitation rings, the initial contact was nothing short of absolute slaughter. Panicked, unarmored citizens were butchered in the choking, spore-filled streets by laughing monsters wielding jagged blades and deafening slug throwers. The planetary defense forces stationed in these perimeter zones were overwhelmed in moments, drowned beneath a tidal wave of roaring green flesh and indiscriminate, joyful carnage. As the slaughter echoed through the collapsing hab blocks and the alien flora took root in the blood-soaked ash, the surviving officers of the Astra Militarum knew that yielding another inch of ground meant total extinction, forcing them to draw a desperate line in the rubble. The retreating survivors from the outer hab blocks crashed against the ultimate manifestation of the Imperium's anvil. Here, across hundreds of miles of hastily poured plascrete barricades, rusted razor wire, and jagged anti-tank traps, the Astra Militarum dug their graves. The skies offered no mercy, weeping black rain that turned the trench networks into a sickening, viscous paste, where mud mixed inextricably with the blood and viscera of the fallen. It sucked at the boots of exhausted guardsmen, anchoring them to the slaughter. There was no grand tactical genius at play here, only the brutally simple, unforgiving mathematics of human attrition. Deafening and ceaseless, the heavy artillery batteries were pushed to the absolute edge of catastrophic failure. The basilisks no longer fired in majestic parabolic arcs toward the distant horizon. Instead, frantic crews leveled the massive Earthshaker cannons, firing at point-blank range directly into the surging green tide.
The catastrophic recoil shattered the eardrums of the gunners and cracked the very foundations of the earth beneath them.
The atmosphere became a toxic, choking fog of cordite, vaporized mud, and the gagging stench of searing alien flesh as tens of thousands of laser guns unleashed continuous blinding volleys into the horde. Yet the true horror of the alien menace lay in its endless, terrifying vitality. For every hulking brute that fell, bisected by scorching Lars light or reduced to a fine crimson mist by high explosive ordnance, 3 more scrambled mindlessly over the smoking, ruptured ruin of its corpse. Entire regiments, tithed from distant hive worlds and trained from birth to serve the Golden Throne, were erased from the administratum ledgers in a matter of minutes. The defensive lines began to bow inward, buckling under the sheer, suffocating muscular mass of an enemy that felt no fear and knew no fatigue. As the physical barricades crumbled, panic began to take root in the minds of the desperate defenders. It was met with the only cure the Departamento Munitorum ever truly provided. Commissars in mud-spattered stormcoats strode through the collapsing, blood-flooded trenches, their weapons dispensing unflinching summary judgment upon those whose courage faltered. To step backward was to invite immediate execution. The front line ceased to be a military fortification. It was held together not by reinforced ferrocrete, but by mountains of shattered human corpses, stacked high to absorb the relentless green fury. The meat grinder spun without mercy, pulverizing the bones of the Emperor's faithful into fine dust. The surviving guardsmen fought on, firing until their power packs melted into useless slag, until their flesh blistered from overheated barrels, until their minds shattered under the sheer auditory trauma of unending slaughter. They were pushed to their absolute, irrevocable breaking point, staring blindly into the gaping, jagged maw of total annihilation as the alien sea prepared to swallow them whole. But even as the ragged human defenders prepared for their final, hopeless stand, unseen eyes watched the geometry of the battlefield perfectly align, and from the shifting shadows of the carnage, hidden forces began to manipulate the bloody tides of war. Far above the deafening slaughter and the blood-soaked mud of the Imperial trenches, a different kind of war was unfolding in the choking shadows of a ruined cathedral spire. Here, there was no roaring artillery, no desperate prayers to the God Emperor, and no mindless bellowing of the alien horde. There was only the absolute, unnatural stillness that precedes the unseen blade. The very fabric of reality shuddered beneath the blackened Gothic arches, parting like gossamer curtains to reveal the pale, shimmering luminescence of a hidden webway portal. From this tear in the material realm stepped the Aeldari. They were the striking scorpions, aspect warriors of a dying race, moving with a fluid, predatory grace that made a mockery of human agility. They did not descend into this war zone out of pity for the dying guardsmen below. To the children of Assyrian, humanity and the orcs are but crude beasts, ignorant insects thrashing blindly in the dirt. The Aeldari had come only to pluck a single, fragile thread from the great tapestry of fate, guided by the cold and esoteric visions of their farseer. The prophecy had decreed that if the Green Tide were allowed absolute victory, the entire sector would fall to ruin. Yet if the Imperium achieved a swift triumph, their expanding crusade would inevitably threaten a dormant craft world. The scales of mutual destruction had to be perfectly balanced. And so, the ghosts of the shattered empire slipped through the ruins to execute their grim calculus. Their target was not a warlord or a towering monstrous engine, but a secluded Imperial communications node relaying vital tactical data to the secondary defense lines. The aspect warriors descended upon the unsuspecting command squad with terrifying synchronicity. There was no battle cry. The heavy, thrumming vibration of their scorpion chains' words was muffled by the sudden, localized disruption of their stealth fields. Shuriken catapults sighed in the darkness, unleashing torrents of monomolecular discs that sliced through flak armor and flesh with absolute, terrifying precision. Within the span of a dozen heartbeats, the sanctified voxcasters were reduced to sparking slag, and the blood of the operators painted the cold stone floors. The Aeldari left no footprints in the dust, no shell casings to betray their presence. As swiftly and silently as they had arrived, they faded back into the labyrinthine corridors of the webway, the portal collapsing into nothingness behind them. Neither the Imperial commanders screaming blindly into dead Vox channels, nor the Orc hordes surging toward the suddenly disorganized flank, could ever comprehend how thoroughly they were being manipulated. The xenological intervention had doomed thousands of loyal soldiers to a gruesome death in the mud, yet it was this precise, calculated sacrifice that forced the hand of the Imperial commanders. With no retreat possible and the localized defensive lines completely severed from high command, the surviving regiments of the Astra Militarum were backed into a corner of pure, unadulterated desperation, priming the crucible for a catastrophic retaliation that the Greenskins could never anticipate. As the battered remnants of the Astra Militarum prepared to sell their lives in the bloody mud, and the unseen hand of the Eldar withdrew into the shadows of the warp, a sudden and unnatural eclipse swallowed the battlefield. The bruised, smoke-choked clouds parted, violently displaced by the sheer mass of an Adeptus Astartes strike cruiser entering low orbit. It was a floating cathedral of void-forged iron and righteous wrath, hanging so low in the firmament that its massive gravitic wake drew the breath directly from the lungs of men and beasts alike. The midday sun was utterly blotted out, casting the ruined, corpse-strewn plains into a terrifying premature twilight. The shadow of the Emperor had fallen across the world. Then came the fire. Scores of falling stars ignited against the upper atmosphere, burning with a furious crimson heat. This was the steel rain. It was not the indiscriminate ruin of orbital bombardment, nor the desperate artillery of dying men. It was the absolute, unyielding spear of humanity, striking with divine malice. The drop pods fell with a meteoric velocity that defied all natural laws, tearing through the sky in a blinding display of kinetic dominance. The air itself seemed to shriek in agony as the adamantium monoliths plummeted toward the surface, a terrifying phenomenon that brought the endlessly roaring Orc horde to a sudden, bewildered standstill. The Angels of Death did not aim for the vanguard. They did not strike at the exposed flanks. Guided by ancient machine spirits and tactical cogitators of flawless design, the armored teardrops aimed directly for the throbbing heart of the green tide. They slammed into the exact center of the horde, impacting dead in the midst of the towering orc warboss and his heavily armored command mob. The earth convulsed in agony. Apocalyptic shockwaves of pulverized rock, shattered armor, and Xeno's blood cascaded outward in devastating concentric rings,
instantly crushing hundreds of greenskins beneath the sheer kinetic force of the planetfall.
Before the dust of the colossal impact craters could even begin to settle, the explosive bolts of the drop pod hatches detonated. The heavy metal ramps slammed into the ruined earth, and the Emperor's Chosen stepped forth into the carnage. They were living gods of war, vast and terrible, clad in holy ceramite. Mass reactive bolter shells erupted in a deafening unified chorus, perfectly placed shots that instantly turned the largest of the orc elites into clouds of expanding red mist and shattered bone. The air grew thick with the heavy scent of promethium and the horrifying mechanical scream of revving chainswords as the Space Marines lunged into the fray. They did not fight with the desperate frenzy of the exhausted mortals in the trenches. They moved with a terrifying, calculated brutality, a flawless meat grinder of genetic perfection tearing through the monstrous orc nobility. Every fluid motion was a brutal execution, every armored footfall a conquest. They carved a path of unimaginable ruin straight toward the hulking, roaring silhouette of the warboss himself, intent on executing a decapitation strike so precise and overwhelming that it would shatter the Xeno's command structure to its very core and unleash a final reckoning upon the shattered plains. The severed head of the beast had barely struck the blood-soaked ferrocrete before the great green tide began to turn upon itself. Without the sheer, brutal gravity of their warboss to bind them, the psychic lattice of the alien horde instantly shattered. Where there was once a singular, unstoppable wave of fury, there was now only fragmented chaos. Rival chieftains turned their crude chain cleavers upon one another, bellowing challenges into the suffocating smog as the horde cannibalized its own momentum.
The siege was broken from within, drowning in its own mindless savagery.
Amidst this sudden disarray, the enigmatic architects of the alien counterstroke vanished back into the shadows. The Aeldari, who had danced through the slaughter with lethal grace, slipped away through a shimmering wraithbone gate. With a silent flash of cold starlight, the portal sealed shut, leaving not a single footprint in the ash to prove the ancient Xenos had ever intervened at all. Above the fratricidal alien lines, the sky roared with the descent of armored gunships. The Adeptus Astartes, their holy duty fulfilled, did not linger to accept the gratitude of mortal men. Heavy transport ships snatched the Emperor's angels from the highest, devastated spires, their thrusters scorching the ruined skyline as they breached the toxic atmosphere, ascending back to their waiting strike cruisers in the cold void. They left behind a world that had been saved only in name. Down in the mud and the irradiated rubble of the lower wards, the surviving men and women of the Astra Militarum stood in stunned, ringing silence. They looked out over a landscape of utter desolation, their lasguns heavy in trembling hands. For every guardsman still drawing breath, 9 of their comrades lay mutilated in the trenches, their broken bodies forming the very earthworks that had held the line. 90% of the planetary defense force had been fed into the meat grinder of this siege, their blood watering a poisoned earth. It was a victory measured only by the fact that they were not yet dead. The hive city around them was a festering wound of chemical fires and collapsed habitation blocks, bleeding radioactive coolant into a dying atmosphere. There were no cheers of triumph echoing through the upper spires, no jubilant hymns of salvation sung by the surviving citizens, for there were almost no citizens left to sing. There were only hollow-eyed survivors, choking on the black snow of falling ash, staring blankly into a burning horizon. The world belonged to the Imperium once more, but its soul had been entirely immolated in the defense. And as the great Prometheum fires slowly burned themselves down to smouldering embers across the ruined continents, the true cost of this grim salvation began to echo upward through the planetary bureaucracy, waiting for the merciless ledgers of the Administratum to tally a butcher's bill so staggering it defied earthly comprehension. The fires had long since burned out, leaving behind a world painted only in the drab hues of corpse ash and dried blood. Months have passed since the final bolt shell was spent, yet the atmosphere remains choked with the foul residue of apocalyptic warfare. Toxic soot rains endlessly from the bruised skies, mingling with the virulent green remnants of orc spores that cling stubbornly to the irradiated soil. The great hive cities, once towering monuments to human endeavor, are reduced to hollowed-out crypts where the wind howls through shattered glass and twisted iron. Hundreds of millions perished so that this insignificant sphere of rock might remain secure in the Emperor's embrace. And what is the reward for such unparalleled devotion? A shuttle of featureless grey descends through the poisonous clouds, bearing the absolute and unforgiving face of the Imperium. It does not carry an angel of death in shining ceramite, nor a priest bearing miraculous relics. It carries a pale, withered clerk of the Adeptus Administratum, clad in the drab robes of the Departamento Munitorum. He steps onto the blasted earth, entirely blind to the weeping orphans and the crippled labourers that line the shattered rockcrete. He does not see martyrs. He does not see heroes.
He sees only data.
A colossal ledger, bound in vat-grown flesh, is produced from his satchel. An auto-quill scratches relentlessly against parchment, tallying the miserable survivors, calculating the remaining industrial output of a world that has been utterly ground to dust. The planetary governor, half-starved and trembling beneath his tarnished finery, awaits a word of salvation. He prays for a promise of relief fleets or emergency ration distributions to feed his starving flock. Instead, the clerk delivers the terrifying calculus of the Adeptus Terror. The imperial tithe has not been forgiven. It is barely even adjusted. The planetary quotas for munitions and manpower are still due at the turning of the standard month. The Imperium does not recognize the concept of a Pyrrhic victory. A world belongs to the Golden Throne, and therefore it must bleed for the Golden Throne, regardless of the ruin inflicted upon it. Those few men and women of the planetary defense forces who survived the greenskin slaughter, whose minds are shattered by trauma and bodies mangled by crude axes, are given no time to mourn their dead. They are not permitted to rest. The clerk systematically stamps their redeployment orders with a heavy wax seal of unquestionable authority. They are herded like grocs onto mass conveyors, packed tightly into the dark, suffocating holds of transport ships bound for a brutal trench war 3 systems over. Their survival was not a triumph, it was merely a brutal qualification for a darker battlefield. In the grim darkness of the 41st millennium, the absolute sole reward for a duty fulfilled is a merciless demand for even greater sacrifice. This is the soul-crushing reality of the human condition: to fight, to bleed, and to be fed into the endless grinder of the Administratum without a flicker of gratitude or remembrance.
Yet, as the transport ships break orbit, leaving the ruined world behind to rot under its impossibly cruel quotas,
one must cast their gaze upward at the indifferent sea of stars. For the absolute horror that just unfolded upon this poisoned rock is not a unique tragedy. Yet for all the blood spilled upon that shattered crust, for all the billions who screamed their last into the choking skies, you must understand the cruelest truth of our epoch. That localized agony was not a war. It was barely a skirmish. It was an insignificant footnote scrawled in the margins of a logistical ledger too vast for any mortal mind to comprehend. Pull back your gaze from the ash of a single doomed world and look upon the macrocosm. Look upon the great segmentums of the Milky Way, where the true engine of total war has been stoked to a blinding incandescence. We have passed beyond the realm of isolated crusades and border disputes. Entire star systems are currently burning. Ancient constellations that have guided humanity for 10,000 years are being violently snuffed out, replaced by the unnatural glare of apocalyptic lance strikes and the sickly, bleeding hues of expanding warp rifts. The Imperium is stripping its worlds bare, rendering whole sectors uninhabitable in a desperate bid to feed the insatiable furnaces of the Munitorum. We are no longer witnessing mere tactical deployments. Full chapters of the Adeptus Astartes are emptying their fortress monasteries, deploying not as scattered strike teams, but as unified wrathful legions of transhuman vengeance. The very crusts of sovereign forge worlds fracture as entire Titan legions are roused from their sacred slumber. These towering god machines walk the earth in unbroken phalanxes, their tread flattening mountains and their devastating weaponry boiling away oceans in a matter of hours.
And the galaxy answers this escalation with an avalanche of nightmares. Infinite alien armadas are blotting out the light of the stars.
Leviathan hive fleets of incomprehensible mass crawl through the void, casting shadows across entire subsectors as they prepare to strip the flesh from 1,000 worlds. Orcish armadas of such unfathomable scale that their scrap fleets possess their own gravitational pull, crash into the Imperial blockades. From the bleeding wounds in reality, the traitor host spills forth in numbers not witnessed since the galaxy burned during the dark days of the heresy. Every faction, every monstrous intellect and desperate warlord is accelerating their war efforts to an apocalyptic crescendo. There is no peace amongst the stars. What the ignorant might call a cessation of hostilities is merely the brief, shuddering silence required to reload macro cannons and march the next billion martyrs into the meat grinder. This is the terrifying momentum of a galaxy locked in an inescapable death spiral. The scale of the slaughter has become a self-sustaining cycle, a storm of absolute violence that pulls every living creature into its inescapable gravity. As the celestial machinery of extermination grinds ever faster, feeding upon the souls of the innocent and the damned alike, the very fabric of reality begins to buckle under the weight of such limitless slaughter, setting the stage for a reckoning that cannot be halted. And so the great wheel of slaughter turns endlessly across a burning galaxy. I sit here in the suffocating dark of this forgotten vault, surrounded by mountains of crumbling records, and I watch the flame of my final tallow candle begin to die. It sputters against the encroaching shadow, a fragile, trembling beacon fighting a futile war against an ocean of absolute night. It is the perfect tragic reflection of our doomed species. We rage against the dying of the light. We build colossal monuments of iron, stone and bone. We cast our billions into the meat grinder of the stars, believing that somehow, through sheer force of will, through rivers of blood and the holy fire of the Inquisition, we might emerge victorious. But hear this truth, etched in the blood of martyrs and the ashes of dead worlds. There is no triumph to be found among the stars. There are no victors in this age of madness, no shining heroes who will deliver us from the encroaching dark. Every Pyrrhic victory won on 1,000 shattered fortress worlds, every desperate last stand that holds the line for another agonizing day, is merely a delay of the inevitable doom. Survival is simply a prolonged death sentence, served in the cold void of a hostile universe. Every drop of blood spilled on the muddy trenches of a forgotten hive world, whether shed in the name of the rotting lord of mankind upon his golden throne, or by the myriad alien empires fighting for their own fleeting existence, serves only one true purpose. It feeds the rot beneath reality. The things in the warp are always watching. The ruinous powers swell with every cry of mortal anguish, with every catastrophic orbital bombardment, with every clash of roaring chainswords and searing blasts of blinding energy. Our ceaseless, agonizing struggle is the sweet nectar upon which the dark gods feast. Our monumental wars, our petty crusades, our grand sacrifices are but the punchline to a cruel, cosmic joke, ringing out across the roiling storms of the Imperium as the endless laughter of thirsting gods. The wax has melted away. The flame dances wildly one last time, choking on its own fumes before surrendering to the void.
The absolute darkness of this archive rushes in to reclaim the damning histories I have spoken into the ether.
My time is done. I trace the cold, rusted metal of this heavy, iron-bound tome, feeling the weight of 1,000,000,000 shattered souls beneath my withered fingers. As I press the massive cover down, sealing these cursed pages away, I reach out blindly to sever the power to this Vox recorder. Let its final mechanical click be my testament. Forget the promise of progress and understanding. Forget the delusion of peace. For in the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war.